Hey guys, what's up? It is Public back with another video, and today we're actually going to be taking a look at the raid that we had access to, which is Castle Nathria. Myself and some other Shadow Priests did testing in this raid. Myself, I did basically 2.5 bosses. I missed 1.5 just because of lag issues, but I did get a pretty good sense of, what are some of the problems that Priest still has in a raiding environment that some of us, predicted would happen, and, how do the Covenant abilities feel, how does the rotation feel, all this stuff. So I'm going to take this video just to kind of aggregate all these thoughts together into a video that way you guys can kind of see what I'm talking about. I have some POVs that I'm going to put in the background of both Hurl, Kael'thas, and Sludgefist. I might have some other footage in there, but the other two bosses were super laggy, so probably just going to talk about these two. Alright, so let's get started. Alright guys, the first thing I want to talk about after doing raid testing is just in general how it feels to play Shadow Priest right now. I think, some people on the Discord and forums and elsewhere have talked about this Devouring Plague, I guess, quote-unquote build that we're doing. And just my 2 cents on it. One, it's not really fun to play. It basically, if you don't know what it is, you're basically trying to keep up Devouring Plague on as many targets as possible for as long as possible. That's like the TLDR, right? And right now, because of the damage that Devouring Plague is doing, it's actually pretty beneficial to do so. And, by doing this, you're basically saying, I don't really care about maintaining Void Form. What I actually care about is maintaining Devouring Plague uptime as much as I can, right? So, and, this is not, I think, like, super fun to play with. There are some problems with Devouring Plague. Not that it can't be fixed, but in the way that it plays right now, you're effectively just saying, once you get to about 18 or 20 stacks of Void Form, you're basically using Devouring Plague to get out of Void Form. That way you can get back in a timely manner, right? And you especially want to do this if you, say, have Mindbender up, if you have PI up to help you get back in quicker. Because we actually care more about, keeping Void Form active as much as possible, rather than just say, hey, get as many stacks of Void Form as possible. And part of that's because, we don't have Chorus of Insanity anymore. We don't have things like Mass Hysteria. All we have is just, Void Form gives you access to Void Bolt, and you get 0.5% haste to stack, right? And that's just not enough to care enough about Void Form, when we also have Devouring Plague on the other hand saying, hey, you could just use me instead and drop out of Void Form, right? Because it costs Insanity. So I think this is kind of the first point I wanted to bring up in saying that, in raid testing, Void Form just feels pointless right now, right? This is especially exacerbated on AoE fights where you just simply don't have time to do anything in Void Form. Like in the Kael'thas footage that you're seeing in the background now, most of my time is just spending dotting things, which takes like kind of a long time because of my levels of haste right now. And I frankly just don't have time for anything else, other than getting into Void Form, casting Devouring Plague once or twice and then leaving, right? That's just kind of how it is right now. And I think this is important, right? Because I'm not sure this was totally intended to happen. And that we're basically saying, I'm going to leave Void from around 20 stacks, right? And now, even if we get more gear and stuff like that, maybe that stack point will change. But right now, we have to drop out of Void Form early to maintain Devouring Plague, because once you get up to like those high echelon of stacks, which is, whatever it is based on your gear level, and our current gear level for me, that's anywhere between like 22 to 30 stacks is this range where I actually can't cast Devouring Plague because I don't have enough Insanity, right? Every time I cast Mind Blast or Void Bolt, I might get to 50, but by the time the GCD processes and then the Insanity drain goes down, I now don't have enough, to cast Devouring Plague. So because of that, I'm actually incentivized to drop out of Void Form earlier than I would otherwise if I care about keeping up Devouring Plague. And I think this is, it's a very weird gameplay loop when you're playing with it. It basically feels like, I'm driving a car, but the brakes are on the entire time, right? Like I'm constantly feel like I'm fighting with the spec to keep Devouring Plague out because I know it's doing more damage, but it doesn't feel like I should be doing that or even should be able to do that. Lots of people in the forums have posted about Devouring Plague, including myself, about how to fix it. I don't want to go on and on about that in this video, but just know that the rotation, has some clear, differences and clear things that are odd of like how it plays right now. I wanted to call that out. And the other thing I want to mention about the rotation before we move on from this is that, we don't have a whole lot of options right now, like from an AoE perspective. We're basically on Kael'thas and fights like that. I'm kind of just sitting there trying to dot as many things as possible and try to keep my dots alive. Because my ability to damage things from a spread environment that aren't all stacked up for Void Bolt refresh is actually kind of hard when you don't have a whole lot of haste, right? And I think this is pretty important. Even if I use Misery or Dark Void, it's still really difficult. And in doing so, I wasn't actually getting much more damage than I would have just playing single target anyway. So our AoE definitely needs some help. I'm going to talk about that a bit in a second when I get to the talent section, but just kind of wanted to quickly bring that up. So that's kind of how it feels to play right now. Let's move on to other things. Okay, the next thing I want to bring up is the legendaries that we have access to. So right now, there are really only a couple legendaries that are worth even talking about. There are other ones like the Leap of Faith one or Casting Power Infusion on an ally. Those are all kind of, either not DPS increases for us or, just something, not really relevant for this. So the ones I want to talk about are the Mindbender Legendary, the Void Tendril one, and the Shadow Word Death Legendary. These are the three that I did the most testing on, that I have the most to say about. And I think right now, honestly, the Mindbender Legendary, the one that reduces Mindbender's cooldown and does some extra damage, is frankly just overtuned right now. I found it was doing not only more damage than the other legendaries, generally speaking, it was also much more consistent. Pairing that with the Mindbender talent just makes this such a great combination. And I was mostly using this for almost all of the raid testing because of that. I did try the other legendaries, specifically the Void Tendril one felt like its niche was on single target. So when we were doing Sludge Fist, I was trying that out, and I was getting some pretty, wide swings of how good it was, how well it was performing. Some pulls it was 2% of my damage, other pulls it was like 8-9% of my damage, but it was just a wide swing in the middle. And I was kind of wondering why that is, because I do remember, like, if I was just hitting a target dummy, I was able to get it to proc quite a lot. But because of the way that our talents are situated right now, and just in general how we are in Shadowlands, we've gained so many more active abilities in things like Shadow Crash. We're casting Mindbender more often. We now have our Covenant ability, right? All of these extra buttons that we're now pressing actively on our rotation, which is then has an opportunity cost of taking away how much we're casting Mind Flay. The proc is, I think it's 2 RPPM right now, so theoretically getting more casts out shouldn't increase the proc rate, but right now, because we're keeping up Devouring Plague and all this stuff, I'm actually not spending that much time casting Mind Flay on a minute by minute basis. I was checking some numbers into live, and it's like about 60% less Mind Flay, like time spent Mind Flaying right now compared to BFA. I don't know if that's contributing to part of this legendary and why it's not, giving me consistent results, but that is kind of a problem. Now, when I did get a proc, it felt really solid because then I could use that to transition out of Void Form and get back in quickly. However, it did make it somewhat hard to transition out if I was getting a bit too much more insanity than I needed. So it was kind of interesting to play around with the Devouring Plague problem, but is what it is. And then lastly, the Shadow Word Death Legendary, I think has some potential. I think most of the value from this legendary actually comes from, whole hogging into Death and Madness and, using that as your playstyle and the conduit for that playstyle, right? Just because, the Shadow Word Death Legendary in and of itself is only about 2 or 3% of your damage, depending on what you're doing on like a single target perspective. But if you're in an AoE situation like Kael'thas and you can get some pretty solid Shadow Word Death snipes out on targets, I was actually getting some pretty decent results with this. I didn't get as many pulls in this as I wanted to test with it because I ended raid testing, but I think it could be somewhat useful. I just don't know, like, numbers-wise, if it's going to work out to be better than Mindbender, because with that legendary, I'm getting significantly less Mindbenders out, and that does hamper my ability to get back into Void Form quickly. So I'm not quite sure if that gives us enough value here. Another thing I do want to call out, this is really hard to judge right now because Death and Madness, and again, not sure if this is a bug or intended, if you kill your target while talented with Death and Madness with Shadow Word Death, it actually doesn't give you the reset. It actually has to give that target the debuff first and then die to get the reset. So in a raiding environment when mobs have a lot of health, this is harder to run into this bug, but it is something I want to call out here, that it is kind of hard to test this in like this environment because I'm not sure if that's a bug or not. I hope it is. That doesn't feel right to me, but who knows. All right, so that's our legendaries. Let's move on to talents. Okay, guys, so I had to bring up our talent tree. It's kind of a mess right now. I noticed this a lot more on raid testing, that I just didn't have answers to things that I thought I had in BFA, or I was able to do more effectively in BFA. And I want to kind of call out what those were. So I'm just going to go through each row of the talent tree and kind of talk about problems that I noticed. So first things first, the level 15 row, I've talked about this forever, but the fact that we don't have Shadow Word Void baseline makes this talent tree effectively dead. There's no reason to take Shadowy Insight or Fortress of the Mind in a raiding environment. It just doesn't make sense. If you pair this with the idea that we have a conduit that can proc a free Devouring Plague on Mind Blast, that effectively gets double as useful if you take Shadow Word Void, there's no reason not to take it, right? Sure, Shadowy Insight can still give you procs that could lead to instant cast Devouring Plagues, but the proc rate doesn't make sense, and the way you play with Shadowy Insight just feels so terrible that I don't think it'll ever make sense. So please, I wish we had 2 charges of Mind Blast baseline, rework this talent row. It's kind of a mess. I'm going to skip the level 25 row just because I think it's fine. It's utility. It's whatever you need it to be. Let's move on to level 30. I think right now, this was actually one of my favorite talent rows inside of BFA. It gave us enough choice of how we wanted to play. I will say, though, it's interesting that because of the target capping that they've done on things, it definitely feels like from a dungeon and raid perspective, there aren't as many situations where I feel like Dark Void actually makes sense, because there aren't as many like giant waves of mobs happening anymore, right? If I'm thinking about use cases where I did use Dark Void in the past, it was typically that there was a constant set wave of ads happening, like 10 plus ads happening every 30 seconds that gave Dark Void a lot of value. But from what I've seen so far in the raid testing in the dungeons, you're hardly ever pulling or able to hit 5 things or more at a time. And by that point, you might as well just use Misery and get both dots out on all targets. Sure, it will take longer than just doing Dark Void, getting Shadow Pain off of everything. But, things aren't exactly clumped either, so I don't really know how much use Dark Void will be getting. But being able to choose between Misery and Twisted Fate, I still think is a good choice. Just because on single target, we're going to pick Twisted Fate as that execute option that we want, and Misery being that kind of spread AoE option or longer lived target option. But yeah, I haven't really seen a great use case for Dark Void yet. Not that there isn't one, but just wanted to call that out. Moving on, we'll go past 35 row. It has problems I've mentioned in the past, right? Like, we need a lower cooldown interrupt to begin with. I don't know why I have to talent into that. Mind Bomb should stun, yada, yada, yada. Moving on to the level 40 row. So this row has Auspicious Spirits, Death and Madness, and Shadow Crash. This is probably the row that has some of the most problems right now that are somewhat easily fixable. First things first, I don't really know why Auspicious Spirits is still in the game. It doesn't really change your gameplay at all. And frankly, they've nerfed it so many times that it's basically useless. Excuse me. So right now, Auspicious Spirits baseline is doing like 1% of my damage right now without the talent. And if I talent into this on single target, I'm getting about 0.5% of DPS from a talent. This is just pitiful. Obviously, this was nerfed for, potentially good reasons in BFA because we were scaling out of control. But now that we're in Shadowlands, this is just dead, right? You will never take this option, even though it feels like we would want to on that spread target option. It just doesn't make sense anymore. So without this getting buffed or whatever, it's never going to get used, I think, in the current state, until maybe we get a crap ton of gear at the end of the expansion. But, who knows how that'll work out. Ideally, I think this just gets deleted and they put something else in its place because balancing this is kind of a nightmare, but, is what it is. Death and Madness, I mentioned why it's not my favorite right now because of that bug. If that gets fixed, maybe this makes more sense, but I think, honestly, a lot of this should just be baked into how Shadow or Death works to begin with, but, that's just my 2 cents. I will, quick note, Shadow or Death right now is giving 15 Insanity baseline, even though the tooltip says it's not. And then adding this talent, you're getting an extra 10 Insanity, I believe. Just want to make sure. I believe it's 10 Insanity. Well, 40 over 4 seconds is what the tooltip says, but I think it's 10. And so basically you're getting upfront 25 Insanity, right? And I think that's a lot of Insanity, but I don't know if that's intended. So who knows? Tooltips are a mess right now, so it's hard to say. But the Insanity values on Death, I don't know if it's a bug or not because tooltips are broken. So, and then, that kind of just leaves us with Shadow Crash, and you're just kind of taking Shadow Crash as the default because the other 2 options hardly ever make sense. I don't really know if that's fun to play with. I've never been a huge fan of Shadow Crash, right? Shadow Crash is only as good as you are at aiming it, and how good the targets are stacked. In our playtesting when we were doing the AoE boss Kale Thoughts, there was, several times where I cast Shadow Crash and then the DK would just grip the mob away from my Shadow Crash, just trying to stack things together more. That was always, it feels bad, so it is what it is. It is an extra button in our rotation, which already is kind of full of new buttons, so it is what it is, but that's how it stands right now. Okay, moving on to level 45 row, same kind of problem. Mindbender just became the de facto here because of I think more or less because of the Legendary. The Legendary makes Mindbender so strong, especially paired with the Conduit. Regardless of your Covenant, I think you want to pick this all the time. Lingering Insanity just doesn't feel great to play with, and honestly, I don't think it's a whole lot of value if we're purposely dropping out of Void Form to keep up Devouring Plague. And I think Mindbender just brings more to the table right now. Void Torrent, same thing. It doesn't give us enough value. It just doesn't do enough. Even if it did more damage, I don't even know if it would make sense because, again, Mindbender is so strong right now. They could tweak some things, tweak the Legendary, whatever, to make this row a bit more competitive. But right now, Void Torrent, Linear Insanity are just depressing. I don't think they have use cases right now. And then last but not least, level 50 row, same story yet again. Legacy of the Void is the choice, right? You cannot not take Legacy of the Void, right? I think this is so apparent to me, especially at levels of haste, because without Legacy of the Void, our cast time on Void Eruption feels like 15 years to get into Void form, and it's just terrible. Maybe there's a use case for Dark Ascension. I don't think so, because Legacy also gives us an extra 5% of damage in Void form. It's just, why would you not take this? I saw 0 use cases for Surrender so far in the raid. Not that they might not exist, but the talent is just poorly designed in my opinion, and the whole row is a mess. So right now, again, we're going to take Legacy of the Void all the time unless something changes, okay? So that's my long rant about the talent tree. Let's move on. All right, guys, the last thing I wanted to bring up in this video before we end it is the Covenant abilities. So myself, I only actually tested Venthyr in this raid, but I think it's fairly easy to kind of judge how the other ones would do. I did all my raid testing with Jarvan and the Future team, and a lot of those guys. Very thankful that they invited me for this round of testing. And I think for the most part, he was a Night Phase Shadow Priest the entire time, so we were able to kind of compare each other. For the most part, we were actually doing basically the same amount of damage, more or less. We were very even with each other all the time. If anything, I was edging him out a little bit more on single target than AoE, but I think that's to be expected as a Venthyr priest. The Night Fate Covenant right now is so inconsistent because the proc is not guaranteed to go on yourself, and it's just random allies within 40 yards. They did fix the pet problem. It was the reduction was going to pets for a period of time. That is now fixed. But now we're kind of back to the same problem of, well, it's 4 random allies. It's not going to be consistent, right? You know, it could go on a Fire Mage for one. It could go on a Mistweaver for one. And those have widely different swings of how useful that reduction is for them. And I think, you know, most importantly, the fact that it doesn't go on the priests themselves makes this a really hard ability to use, because you're effectively, you know, wasting Void Form stacks or wasting Void Form uptime to keep this up. It's just another button to press and maintain, and then you might not get any value from it at all, which just feels really horrible. I hope that they fix this and either just remove the ability or straight up rework it, or at the very least make it guaranteed to go on the priests themselves. Otherwise, you know, we're kind of fulfilling this support role without getting any benefit. And as a Shadow Priest damage class, this doesn't feel great. So I hope they look into that. Venthyr, you know, still not great. It's fine. There is some intricacy with what you can do. There is an adversary soulbind that I was using from Nathria, where you basically have a priority target that gets marked the first time you hit something. You can only have that on one target at a time. I wasn't doing a very good job of using it, but I feel like that could have some good interaction if you're like, oh, this is my priority target, I'm going to focus that down. The only problem is, well, what if that's the wrong one? What if the raid needs to focus a different one? So that's kind of off or iffy. But otherwise, you know, the Venthyr Covenant ability wasn't doing that much damage, you know, between like 2 and 5% on single target. AoE is just a terrible ability. I'm pretty sure this ability is probably just not even worth using in AoE, especially considering, you know, out of all of the raid testing that I did, I hardly ever noticed getting Insanity back from the Venthyr ability. Just a quick note, if you didn't know, the Insanity component of this is actually tied or split into 2 components, right? It's a total of 40, but you get 20 back if from the target healing something, but then damaging instead. And you get another 20 back if they damage something and then they heal that instead, right? Because it has those 2 opposite components to get you the 40. But nonetheless, I never really saw this ever happening, so I never even got the 20 Insanity, just because, you know, bosses are swinging so slowly that the tanks just weren't getting hit. So I wasn't getting a whole lot of Insanity procs with this, which just feels terrible. Until that gets fixed, it's going to be pretty weird to press. And the last thing I want to bring up, again, I didn't test specifically with Kyrian or Necrolord, but the fact that their Covenant abilities are AoE focused and somewhat in melee, especially Kyrian's. It's only 8 yards for the initial, the Ascended Blast, or Nova, I think? Nova. It's just, I don't know if it's going to have a great use case, right? There are so many times where, especially on the encounters that we just tested, where being in melee is a problem, right? On 2 of the bosses I tested, specifically the range were told to stay as far away as possible or be in a group clumped away from the melee. And so to basically say like, hey, actually I need to go into melee real quick to use my Covenant ability, that feels really weird. Necrolord has this problem a bit less because, you know, it clearly has a niche of an AoE fight. But once you move that into single target, it's going to go from doing, you know, 9-10% of your damage on AoE to, say, you know, 1 or 2%, right? And it's just not going to be super worth it on single target, especially if you're not even in range of your target. Kyrian has this problem, but even worse. For example, on Sludge Fist, you've probably seen footage in the background. You actually get chained with another player. So if you get chained with someone else, you have to then convince them to move into melee so you can use your Covenant ability. That just doesn't make sense. You're not going to do that, right? So there's already a fight where the Kyrian ability is just dead. Like, you just won't use it on that fight. And so I think because of that, it's just kind of, exacerbating the problem of these two abilities being melee-ish focused, or at least closer to your target than typically. And that's definitely a problem. So right now, all of them basically don't feel great. I think if I had to pick one right now that I would want to take in raid, it would probably be Venthyr, but Venthyr still doesn't feel great. Like, if anything, it's a 5 out of 10, right? And just everything else is just bad. Nightfade could make sense because of the cooldown reduction, but who knows? That's still up in the air. So, all right, guys, that is all my rambling done for our first round of raid testing. I will be doing as much of this as I can to keep bringing you more content of how the raid feels as a Shadow Priest, but that's what we have right now, okay? Hope you guys enjoyed. Have a good one.